This episode of On the Bookshelf, featuring Ian Thomsen, is sponsored by the Winthrop Book Depot and Cafe, located at 11 Somerset Avenue. When the NBA playoffs roll around in April, basketball fans will be able to read a new book, The Soul of Basketball, the epic showdown between LeBron, Kobe, Doc, and Dirk that saved the NBA. Welcome once again to On the Bookshelf. I'm Pete Solomon, and our guest is Ian Thomsen, the author of The Soul of Basketball. Ian, thank you for being with us. How did you determine that the NBA needed these people to save it?
That's a great question. Well, the book starts in the summer of 2010 when LeBron went on television. LeBron James went on television. People might remember he had a TV reality show for one night. It bombed, did great ratings.
It also raised a lot of money.
Yeah, it did for ESPN, and it did. It got a great share, and it ruined his reputation. It turned a guy that was supposed to be the savior of the NBA, the next generation star, the closest thing the NBA had seen to Michael Jordan, and it turned him into a villain that everybody hated. And at the same time, that season, the NBA was facing a lockout in the midst of a global recession. The players and the owners could not agree on the collective bargaining agreement, and they were headed for a lockout. They were going to shut things down in the middle when the economy was tanking all over the world. And then there's the whole question of basketball was in a bit of a crisis too as well, because after all these years, after more than a century, no one really had yet to identify the higher calling of basketball, the meaning of it. You know, we think of baseball as the game of summer, and football is a game of the military. Americans understand those sports. They know baseball is a game of peace, timelessness. Football is a game of war. We don't know what basketball is, and we never have. And as a result, I think people refer to basketball as the black sport. It's debased in a way, and it allows basketball to be cast in racial terms. And whenever basketball and the African American player is in trouble, you often hear code words, punks, thugs. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that basketball has not been identified. So all of that was up in the air in that season, and by the end of the book, it all gets resolved.
Interesting. Now, I want to continue to talk about the book, but first, pop quiz.
Yeah.
4 individuals in the sports world, very familiar.
Yeah.
Brent Musburger,
Right.
the legendary sportscaster. The wonderful Christine Brennan
Yeah.
of USA Today, terrific columnist. Rachel Nichols, who has a daily show on ESPN, centering on basketball. And Michael Wilbon. What do they have in common?
Well, they all went to Northwestern, and I went to school with 2 of them.
Which 2?
Well, I walked in as my freshman year, at the very beginning of my freshman year. I went to high school in Mobile, Alabama, my last 2.5 years. So I walk in, I still had a bit of a southern drawl back then. I walk in, and the first person to greet me in the office of the student newspaper, the Daily Northwestern, was Christine Brennan. She was the managing editor, and she could not have been nicer. And the way she comes across on television today, that's how she was the first time I met her, and it's the way she's always been ever since. She was a senior. Michael Wilbon was a senior. Yeah, I knew them both. Great guys. When I was at Northwestern, I called up Brent Musburger and did a column on him. And I've met Rachel Nichols since and know her very well.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, when you entered the Medill School of Journalism, did you pretty much know what you wanted to do with your life?
You know, I just knew what I didn't want to do, and it was basically everything else. I couldn't think of anything else to do. And so I applied to journalism school, and I think it helped me to get into Northwestern because I was from Mobile, Alabama. I don't know that there were many people applying to Northwestern back then from Mobile, Alabama. So that's a hint. If you want to go, you should move to Mobile, Alabama, although I don't think that applies anymore. Back then it did.
Well, after college, you wind up working for the Boston Globe, and I know one of your beats was Boston College football at a time when the BC Eagles had a strong football team and a Heisman Trophy winner. That must have been a fun beat.
Oh, it was fantastic. I'd been an intern at the Globe the summer before, and they hired Jackie McMullen and I both at the same time right out of college.
Because they needed front court help too?
Yeah, exactly. She could post me up anytime she wants. And I remember my boss, Vince Storia, who went on to run ESPN for a long time. He he called me up while I was still in college, and he said, we've decided what you're going to do. I don't know if you've heard of this guy. He's a little quarterback at Boston College, Doug Flutie. Looks like a pretty good player. We've never covered Boston College as a beat, but you're going to do that. You're going to be around that team. So I was with them for 2 years. And after he threw the pass in Miami at the end of the second season, his senior year, I was in the office early one morning, and Will McDonough, who I shared a desk with, the great old Boston Globe columnist, he said, you ought to write a book about Doug Flutie. And I'm like, come on. I was, 22 years old, 23 years old. And he said no. And he called up a guy in the building, this guy, Cheeb Everett. And they had me write a book about Doug Flutie, and I did it in 3 days. So I don't know what we call it as far as literary achievements. In fact, when Doug Flutie went to play for the Chicago Bears, a reviewer read the book a few years later. And I think he was under the misassumption that Doug had helped write it. And he said, he noted in his review that Doug Flutie was no Ernest Hemingway. And to this day, I get letters from my old college friends who say, Ian, parentheses, not Hemingway, Thomsen on the address.
So in 1985, Flutie, with an exclamation point, was published. And then there was a great experiment, the National Sports Daily, with what is commonly referred to as a murderer's row of sports writers. Yeah. What does a media event writer do?
Media event?
Yes, was that not your responsibility, a media event writer?
It might have been. It was so long ago. They hired 4 of us to write these magazine-length stories that went into the middle of the National. And they'd be 3,000 to 4,500 words long. And it was Charlie Pierce, famous of the Boston Herald, John Ed Howard, Peter Richmond, and myself. We were the 4. And then they hired all these famous people to write for it.
Frank DeFord at the top of the pyramid.
Yeah, he was the editor, and he hardly ever wrote for it, which disappointed all the readers.
Including me.
Yeah, me too.
But were you influenced in any way by his presence? Or his
all the time. All the time. It was a very volatile place. For starters, they hired way too many editors. So whoever was the last editor to leave would tear up the newspaper and do it the way he wanted, and the other editors would come in the next morning all angry. We were spending much more money than we were making. I'm convinced people were stealing millions of dollars in kickbacks in the publishing of it, in the printing of it, which is how we lost $125 million in a year and a half in 1990 money. Yeah. Hard to do.
We should make it clear that, like a number of publications in other countries in the world, the National was created as a daily sports newspaper.
Yeah.
And Frank DeFord was, as I said, at the top of the pyramid. And there were so many outstanding writers there. The quality of the work was very good, but you couldn't get it. It was hard to get it delivered. I only got to read it when I was on the road.
Yeah. And to deliver it, we used the Wall Street Journal trucks. But they went out early because they didn't care about the sports scores.
Sure.
You would buy the National, and if you lived in New York City, and you wouldn't have the Yankee score in it. How can you make a living selling the sports newspaper without the scores from the night before? So there were all sorts of problems. To this day, I'm really honored to have worked there. People still bring it up all the time. It had it was ESPN before Al Gore invented the internet.
So off you go to Paris and London to work for the International Herald Tribune. What kind of an experience was that?
That was life-changing, and I had no intention of ever doing such a thing. But the editor there, his name was John Vinegar, a brilliant editor, and an award-winning magazine writer for the New York Times and the foreign correspondent for them. He was the editor of the Herald Tribune in Paris, and he was looking to hire a full-time sports writer for the first time. They hadn't had one. And when the National went out of business, he called up Frank DeFord and asked for some names of people who were looking for work. And I was one of 6 names that Frank passed on, and I got the job. And I think I was the only one that really wanted it. Both my parents are from Europe. And I remember having the interview with John. He was staying at the Ritz, the old Ritz in Boston. And I was walking back to my apartment in the South End from the interview, and I said to myself, if I don't really go for this job, I'm going to regret it for the rest of my life. This is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. And I have friends in the business, Scott Price from Sports Illustrated and other people who tell me it's the greatest job in the history of sports writing.
Interesting. Do you write differently in that environment than you would if you were writing to people who had seen the event last night on TV?
Yeah, it's a great question because that was the hardest thing to learn. I was told from the start, you're writing for a universal audience. The Herald Tribune was the largest newspaper around the world. It went to every country 6 days a week, the same edition in English. Went to South Africa, went to Bulgaria, went to Italy, went to the United States, went everywhere, Canada, everywhere, Australia. And you were told to write as if the reader was an expert in the sport or if he knew nothing about it. And everywhere I went, because there's no baseball over there to speak of, there's some basketball, I end up writing a lot about basketball, no American football. Everywhere I went, I was the dumbest person in the stadium, everywhere I went. So if there were 80,000 people at Twickenham for an England-France rugby match, 79,999 knew more about rugby than me, and I was writing for the world's largest newspaper about the event. So you had to learn to tell these universal stories about the people and not get caught up in the details of the sport. When the details were relevant to the story, yes. And that was a hard thing to learn, not being able to just imagine that the reader knew everything about what you were talking about. You had to tell the story while explaining it, and it was a great thing to learn.
Then from there on to Sports Illustrated, where everybody thinks they know as much about sports as you do. What kind of challenge is
they're right. That was a hard transition for me to go from the freedom that I had in Europe to go into a magazine that was very heavily edited, very, very successful, with a long run of success, the most powerful print publication in sports. There was a lot of arrogance there, well earned, and the circumstances, the dynamic were just completely different. And I was there for a couple of years, and in fact, my friend Jackie McMullen had been there before I got there. And when she left in 2000, she had been covering the NBA. They moved me over to cover the NBA in her place. And ever since 2000, I've been focused on the NBA, which led to ultimately to me doing this book.
And your current position at NBA.com, is there a difference between writing for them? Apparently, the real basketball aficionado reads you on a regular basis there, as opposed to when you were at Sports Illustrated and people sifted their way through the magazine and read all kinds of stories. Is it more focused?
There is. I mean, it was very. It was another change in point of view to go from Sports Illustrated to NBA.com and to know that you were writing once again for a universal audience, because the audience for NBA.com is around the world all over again.
Mm-hmm.
And basketball is the only American sport that really has truly an international following, and it's really why I believe the NBA will be the #1 sport in America sooner than later. It's the only sport that has a chance to grow, and as we go to a form of television that goes beyond the cable box and is strictly through the internet cables, and you can be anywhere in the world watching any channel you want in that future, I think the NBA is really going to take off.
Well, let's go back to your upcoming book, which will be released on the 17th of May, 2018. We were talking briefly, and I'd sort of like to elaborate on this, about the people who wound up in the subtitle, beginning with LeBron. You talked about The Decision, the reality show that aired on the 8th of July in 2010. And you're right, it really changed people's focus. People were very disappointed when he left his home area from Akron to Cleveland. He was actually balancing the Cavs on his shoulders, and suddenly there he was in Miami with Chris Bosh. Dwayne Wade was already there. The NBA, because I guess of the roster size, is really the only one of our North American stick and ball sports where players can get together and form their own teams.
Yeah, and he was doing it for the first time, really. A lot of people didn't like it. It's happened since, and we're going to see more and more of it. The owners in the NBA want the contracts to be shorter. It used to be you could sign a 7-year contract as a player, and now it's down to 5. And with each successive collective bargaining agreement, I think you're going to see the numbers go down. What you get from that is more and more free agency. And so I think we're going to see more and more, and we're going to get more and more used to it, that the players are going to have more power. But LeBron was the test case for that.
Mm-hmm.
And he made it much worse by going on TV.
Sure.
Because here he was from Akron, 45 minutes south of Cleveland. And he had been portrayed coming into the NBA as a savior for the city of Cleveland, Northeast Ohio. They had not won a championship in any sport since the 1960s. And their city had suffered greatly in a number of recessionary climates, and the manufacturing, it just was a shell of what it had been. And there was this hope around LeBron that he was going to create a sense of resurgence and bring the city back to its old glories. And then when he was thinking about leaving, for him to turn his fans into sort of sitting on the edge of their seats, hostages, waiting to find out from a live TV show if he was going to leave, he used them as his pawns to create suspense for the TV show. And that really hurt him, as it should have. And he spent the rest of his career learning from it and doing better by it.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Kobe Bryant. He had a very unusual upbringing, partly in Italy, partly in suburban Philadelphia, because his father, Joe Jellybean Bryant, was an outstanding player both in the NBA and overseas. Mm-hmm. He didn't have to deal with a lot of the challenges and hardships that some of his teammates did as they were growing up. And apparently, it has affected his acceptance in the league on various Laker teams he played for. But he has had an incredible work ethic and a tremendous career. What are your thoughts on him?
You know, when I first moved back to the States from Europe with Sports Illustrated, my first assignment was to write a story about Kobe Bryant. And they said it has a good chance to go on the cover, and it did. He was on the cover with Magic Johnson. And it was his second year with the Lakers, and I spent hours talking to him. He picked me up at my hotel in Los Angeles. We drove to some outdoor restaurant. We sat outside for 4 hours. Fans were coming up to him. Do you play for the Lakers? What's your name? They didn't know who he was. I met him in Toronto another time. But I think the thing about his time in Europe was that it taught him the fundamentals. He became the first player to use video to teach himself how to play. Now everybody does it. Everybody watches all the all-time greats and they study the footwork and they try to recreate the moves. He was the first one. He did it with VHS tapes growing up in Italy. And his dad, as a player, would have Lakers games sent over. They had a service. They would send VHS tapes over every week. And also Joe Bryant's parents would send over tapes. Mm-hmm. And Kobe would watch the games with his dad and then go out in the backyard or go over to the park and practice the moves. And I think that also contributed to him being very much a loner within his teams. That was how he taught himself how to play. In this book, I think Kobe's role is to come out as sort of the upholder of the competitive values of the NBA. A real crisis for the NBA was after Michael Jordan retired in 1998. What does the league stand for? Who is the role model? Who's the identity of the league? And they suffered looking for one. There was never anyone suitable for it. That could be both a commercial success and the success on the court. Kobe, because of his problems with the law, he was accused of rape one summer in Colorado. The case was dismissed, but nonetheless, it stuck with him. And he had to learn to view his role in the game in a different way. And I think he became the hard man, the tough guy, the bad guy a lot of times, who forced all the other young players to live up to his values. He was the hardest competitor that anybody of that generation had ever seen. And I think that became his role, and that's what it is in this book. He's the one that forces everybody else to play hard.
Doc Rivers is an important factor in your book. He had an outstanding career coming out of Marquette University, playing as a point guard for several teams in the NBA, went into coaching, had success with the Magic, had success with the Boston Celtics that ultimately he coached them to an NBA championship.
Yes.
But then he was actually traded from the Celtics to the Los Angeles Clippers. He became the coach there. That's sort of unusual in sports. It's happened a couple of times in baseball.
Yeah.
But what about Doc and his role in your book?
You know, it's funny, when I first started it, there were 4 main characters, and I wanted the 4th one to be Rajon Rondo, the point guard of the Celtics, who I had a good relationship with, but I could not get him to cooperate for this book. And so in midstream, I switched over to Doc, and I asked if Doc would speak with me. And I knew him very well from his time coaching the Celtics. This is in 2010-11. And he agreed, and I'm so grateful it worked out this way, because I really feel that he became sort of the backbone, or for a book called The Soul of Basketball, he provided it with its soul. There are stories of the problems of racism that he's overcome in his life. And in his coaching of the team, he refers very often to real world events and tries to let the players know that they are not separate from these things. From Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. He tells all kinds of stories. He works them into his pregame speeches. And he gets the players to see that they're part of a larger world, that their sport is a theater to what's going on in America. You know, that in basketball now, there's players from all over the world, all colors, all shapes and sizes. You can see them all. They're not covered with helmets or
no armor.
Exactly. You can see their color. You can see their identity. Their culture is obvious, and they're all forced to work together. And if they don't work together, they lose. And it's that simple. And it really is a theater to America.
You talk about basketball and its place in the world. It's the 2nd most popular sport in the world. In 1984, the U.S. sent the first team of professionals to the Barcelona Olympics. They were known as the Dream Team, and rightfully so. They are considered by many to be the greatest aggregation put together in sports, and they rolled through the competition. And many American fans said, well, this is silly, every game is a walkover. But not a lot of Europeans had the same idea. They had an opportunity to see just how high the bar could be set. At that time, Dirk Nowitzki was a little boy in Germany, and he grew up to be maybe the best power forward in the game. Yeah,
and he told me that when he was watching the team, and that was that gave him a lot of inspiration to see them, and he loved Charles Barkley. That was his favorite player on the team. You know, I never would have guessed that.
No, neither would I. I would have thought it would be a taller player.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And then when he was 16, a couple of years later, he was discovered by a guy, Holger Geschwindner, who was a retired German player, and who had been the team captain of the German national team in the 1972 Olympics in Munich. And he discovered Dirk as a 15, 16-year-old and decided that Dirk had potential to go to the NBA and started building up a program for him. He developed a way of shooting just to suit Dirk Nowitzki. And they spent years working on their program. He got him to the NBA, and to this day they work together all these years later.
So 4 diverse characters from 4 diverse backgrounds, that's sort of a microcosm of basketball itself, isn't it?
Yeah. And in the end, who saves the day? The immigrant. The guy who had the greatest feeling for the ideals of the American game was the one guy who dreamt of coming to America, who did not take it for granted, who cared nothing for the commercialism. And the NBA was in a commercial crisis. Which is more important, making money, being famous, or is it winning the game, playing as a team? For Dirk, it was always the latter. It was always about playing the game. And I think he's going to deserve a lot of credit looking forward for the fact that the NBA came out of that season of crisis and turned the corner, and now the future could not be more bright for that league, for LeBron James, or for the sport of basketball.
And carrying the banner now, the Golden State Warriors are a great example of a team, the players, essentially, when they added Kevin Durant, got the superstar to play alongside other superstars in a very cohesive way. Steve Kerr is a very unique individual as their coach. They play for him, play very hard. Is that the future of basketball?
Yeah, the future keeps rewriting itself just like our country, but it is, and it's very funny. LeBron's now in his mid-30s, and now he's trying to fend off the next iteration of himself. They formed their team in a way, and it's a super team, just like LeBron tried to form in Miami with Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, with Pat Riley, who I must say Pat Riley was a great asset to this book. I spent hours speaking with him. He provided me a lot of insight behind the scenes on what was going on in Miami with LeBron during that season. I'm very grateful to him, and I think he makes a big difference in this, in the telling of this story. But you're exactly right. And someday before we know it, the Golden State Warriors are going to be facing the challenge of their own. Someone else is going to come up and knock them off. You know, a lot of people think the Warriors are a sure thing, and they probably are. But no one's ever totally healthy going into a playoff series, are they, after a long season? And I'm not going to write off LeBron in Cleveland yet.
The future of basketball. How about the future of Ian Thomsen? What do you have on the back burner? Do you have other thoughts for projects for down the road?
Yeah, I'd love to write another book. I'd like it to take longer than 3 days, which is what Flutie took. And I'd like it to take less than 6 years, which is what this one took. So I think I have quite a wide range of possibility there, but thanks for asking.
Well, thanks for coming. It was a great pleasure visiting with you again, and we appreciate it. And we wish you great success not only with the book, but with your daily activities at NBA.com. And we certainly look to you, as many do, for your thoughts and insights on the NBA, which is a very complicated undertaking, isn't it?
No, I appreciate it. It's not as hard as I make it look.
Well, thank you. Ian Thomsen, our guest on the Bookshelf. I'm Pete Solomon. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to visiting with you next time. This episode of On the Bookshelf featuring Ian Thomsen is sponsored by the Winthrop Book Depot and Cafe located at 11 Somerset Avenue.